Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life Edge, because life just doesn't have to be mediocre. And joining me today, we have Dr. Susan Nash. How are you, Susan?
I'm good. And did you know that today is International Pet Day?
International what day? Pest?
Pet, pet,
Pet.
pet,
Pet day.
not pest,
Is
pet.
that so?
So I was
I
thinking,
heard. I go
I was
pest.
thinking
Really?
about, well, I was thinking about your dog, and
Is that
so
why?
anyway,
Okay, International
yeah.
Pet Day. Well, that's nice. That's a good day. We should all pet one of our animals or whatever we have. That's great. It's a good day to have. So we have a great guest today. We will introduce Brian Matthews in a moment. Here we go. And Susan, would you do the honors today?
Absolutely. We're so glad to have Dr. Brian Matthews from Texas A&M, Texarkana, and he's a professor in the College of Business. And welcome, Brian.
Well, good afternoon. How are you guys doing?
We are great. I'm
Good.
so glad you could join us.
Well, wonderful. It's definitely a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. And Texas A&M is a great school.
It is an outstanding school. We
Yeah.
have awesome students, an awesome president, awesome provost, and we have a spectacular servant leadership in the dean. And so you can't ask for a better place to work.
No, and in fact, she was talking about International Pet Day. A lot of our vets have come from Texas A&M. And
Very
that's what, when she
nice.
said that, I was going, "Oh, what a coincidence!" They've been excellent vets and just really good people. So we know the college from that and from other things that we've met in the past. And Dr. Susan said she's worked there before, taught classes, taken classes, and so that's great. So again, we are glad you could join us. And now you specialize in leadership, correct?
Yes, sir. I actually specialize in leadership in my Principles of Management course, which is a lower level leveling course. We talk predominantly and extensively about leadership and how it affects organizations and culture.
And boy, when you talk about leadership today, what's going on with leadership or lack thereof? It's such a tough one in the workforce today to find people, what I call willing to be accountable and yet willing to also be leaders. And I know it's not the university fault for not teaching that, but, and, I'm sure you guys are teaching a great course on that just based on the reputation for Texas A&M, but what is one of the problems with leadership today, or lack thereof? At least, we see it in a lot of different companies. What do you see?
I think it's a lack of accountability. Being a leader in any organization, in any type of organizational context, I mean, it's very complicated. You are managing people with different personalities, with different perceptions,
Yeah.
different perspectives. And that's one of the things that's very complex with leadership because you're dealing with a conglomerate of, shared beliefs, shared values,
Hmm.
shared theologies, and those things are descriptive and perceived, and they're shared mutually within the organization. It's very hard to calculate culture because it's not static, it's constantly moving. And so that's another added layer that augments the complexity of leadership.
It's an interesting. It's a quagmire, isn't it? of
Absolutely.
of issues.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, the other thing too that I always find interesting about leadership is the issue of communication.
Hmm.
And I'm curious to ask, what are your views of cross-cultural communication? How can we do it well?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's one that needs to be investigated with a degree of rigor. Um, the paradigm and the dynamic of just the organizational structure itself is adapting so rapidly from hybrid organizations to matrix organizations to lateral organizations, vertical organizations. But even in that adaptive shift, contingent upon whatever strategic group you're competing in, you have a diverse portfolio of employees, and so learning cultural dynamics, whether an individual comes from an individualistic society or a collectivist society, whether the power distance is an imperative element within their respective culture, relative to communication, building relationships, low context environments, high context environments, knowing how individuals respond, again, relative to, the personality and just a unique combination of emotional thought and behavior patterns, finding out how individuals react in different situations, and then how they interact with others in those same situations. And so as we talk about the complexity of leadership, I think as it relates to, just the job itself, the implementation of being a leader, I think leaders need to fully understand who they're leading and then have a high degree of emotional intelligence.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear you talk about emotional intelligence as well as the whole idea of like basically like Hofstede or Hall, the idea of high context and low context organizations. And I have a question. How do you lead and how do you use emotional intelligence in a situation where people are having layoffs and there's a lot of insecurity?
I think one of the elements of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, self-management, being able to be vigilant, being able to be aware and acutely aware and mindful of the emotional responses of others, being able to ascertain and deduce when there may be an issue. Even as you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as it relates to security, contrary-wise, if you do have employees that are insecure, being able to detect that, finding out the essence or the crux of the insecurity, where it may be originating, and then as a leader, how do you stimulate that employee to be an agent for an outcome? Because obviously you have leaders that could possibly be managers, just given the day-to-day functionality of a manager. And the ultimate goal of a manager is to accomplish a goal or a set of goals through an arranged, purposefully deployed group of individuals to accomplish a goal or a set of goals. So I think it's really understanding and being attuned to your employees, understanding the relationship, understanding your leadership dynamic as it relates to being task-oriented or relationship-oriented. Finding out what's going on, with that employee. Is the proper work-life balance in place? Has that been instituted? Has that been established? If there's an absence, how can it be fulfilled? So, again, I think it's employing a level of emotional intelligence and then mitigating that level of insecurity by building a relationship. And then, and as you mentioned earlier, when you look at a high context environment, trying to develop that among your employees.
Oh, I like that. So even if we are in a culture that overall is low context and everybody's supposed to be independent and fend for themselves, I like what you're saying. You're suggesting that the organization can be high context and create a lot of trust and relationships that are kind of like glue.
Absolutely. Even when you look at the characterization of a leader relative to them being transformational or transactional, studies and articles, and I'm pretty sure you read articles that can corroborate this subsequent statement. But there should be a marginal degree of a transactional foundation, to the degree that it's somewhat mechanistic, that there needs to be structure, there needs to be a level of formality, there needs to be some rigidity, there needs to be some formalized boundaries. That's as it relates to the low context environment where individuals are independent, artifacts are tactile, they are visible, individuals are seen as those persons that can do a job and complete a task without being micromanaged. And not that individuals in a high context environment don't need that same level of supervision, but I think it needs to evolve into a high context environment where it may be somewhat more informal. It is organic, it is flexible. There is a less presence of rigidity. There are more lateral communications as opposed to, horizontal, and there are open lines of communication there. But I think there still needs to be a level of structure so you mitigate any type of confusion.
I like that.
And it's interesting about the structure because a lot of times, especially with new managers, they think that they have to be everybody's friend, and they wind up getting in all sorts of messes because they removed a line of not necessarily communication, but a line of, like you said, structure, which is important. If you look at the military, for example, there's a definite line of structure, and short of special forces types, in the military, there's not that much relationship between the troops and the officers. And I used to wonder, why is that? And I've talked to quite a few ex-military guys and some present military guys who say they do it because of the nature of their jobs. And if they get too friendly, they can't do their job. And it's an interesting thought. And just the opposite happens usually in a corporation where people become too friendly and then wind up realizing that that's misinterpreted as, oh, great, I can get away with anything. And that happens a lot too. So you're right. You don't want total rigidity, but you need that kind of invisible separation, if you will, to get people to realize there is a job to do. We have to do something. You may have issues or problems or whatever else, but that's not the key part of the whole job. But it's something that we'll recognize as need be. I talked to some. I guess they were marriage and family therapists, but they were counselors, basically. They were licensed psychotherapists and everything else. And they were saying that there's a real problem in the workplace right now. It's with exactly what you mentioned, emotional IQ. The EQ is really low among a lot of younger people, especially females, is what they were saying. And they said the reason was a lot of the younger females were using emotions to control every and any situation that they could, which created problems at home, at work, at school, and everywhere else. And she was saying as a therapist, they saw the results of that quite a bit. And it was just fascinating hearing that. Have you run into any of that or that type of comment that emotions are used to control rather than to really communicate?
Well, even when you look at the Big Five personality virtues, and emotional stability is one of those things. And being able to properly manage your emotions, being able to respond accordingly with a level of decorum, with a level of professionalism, knowing how to communicate without extensive instability, knowing when to make concessions, knowing that there are situations outside of your control. Emotions can't control every situation. I think when it is programmed that emotions can control different situations, because whatever outcomes ensue this emotional control, it somewhat reaffirms that, okay, this emotional charge is the solution to controlling the situation. And so when that theory is interrupted, then you have this emotional stability that takes place. Like, why did my emotions work this time? And so, again, I think even as it relates to emotional intelligence and an individual having a self-awareness and being able to self-manage their emotions, I think that will eliminate mistakenly believing or inducing that an emotional employment can dictate, can influence, and can engender situations.
Good.
Oh, that makes sense.
Well said.
Now,
Yep.
well, so I have a question for you, Rick. So why are they girls and not boys? And I get this image of these like manipulative, coercive little girls.
Well, what the therapist mentioned was boys today are being taught to be afraid of everything. Girls are being taught to be very much more dominant, and they learn at early ages that emotional dominance is easy or easier. And this is coming from, by the way, these were female therapists I was talking to. There were about 3 of them that I've talked to in the past, and they worked at what are they called? There's centers where they deal with kids at risk either in drugs or other problems. And so they're used to seeing, and they had more girls than boys in all these schools. It was really rather interesting. But they were used to that, and they saw the behaviors over and over and over again. And they also dealt with corporations where they did outreach programs. Same problems they were getting. They were getting the situation where emotions were used to control everything and everyone. And they said they would say like 75. I don't know if they have any accurate data as far as statistics, but they said just 75%. They were saying about 3/4 of their population was doing this. And I was going, that's fascinating. And they weren't talking cross-culture or anything else. They were just talking the patients that they had. And it was probably a wide range of culture and everything else. So very interesting. It just was something that we see in businesses when we work with a certain amount of it, not a lot, but because we're usually dealing at more management levels. But they talk about the problems they're having with emotional intelligence, with EQs, with people who aren't quite getting the program or aren't working well with others. And a lot of times, when you can't work with them, what do? They either try to control someone, they try to, and it could be a whole series of things, but invariably, people who aren't working well within a structure in a corporation or with management or with fellow coworkers. And so the poor managers have to figure it out usually, and not therapists more often than not. So it's a tough one.
So, Brian, what would you do if you were faced with a bunch of coercive
what would I do?
Girls. Now, what would Brian do? What would you do?
Oh, Brian.
As a leader.
I think Rick hit the nail on the head as he begins to open up this conversation in terms of emotional intelligence. Having an awareness or an insight to your emotional IQ. Whenever you look at those individuals that are low modifiers as opposed to those individuals that are high modifiers, if I'm an individual that is a high modifier, I can adapt to any situation. So regardless of what the situation is, regardless of the variability or the lack thereof within that situation, regardless of the constituents within that particular situational context, I can adapt with the level of dexterity. So I'm not restrained by my emotions because the situation itself doesn't confine me to act a certain way or a specified way or a way that's idiosyncratic. I can adapt emotionally in any situation. Those individuals that are low modifiers, they're somewhat constrained by their limitation and being finite in that sense. And so I would venture to say that's why you have some individuals that they do use their emotions to manipulate certain situations. Because obviously, the more I'm boxed in, so to speak, within a situation, I need some kind of way to give myself some room. And so in order to do that, if I am a low modifier, then I resort to, again, what may have historically worked in the past, and that's being able to manipulate situations emotionally. In the event that does happen, and what I would suggest for leaders is, again, understanding what triggers that emotion, what contributes, or what that emotional trigger can be attributed to. Is it something that's just a part of an individual's personality? Is that who they are? Are they typically and historically and patternistically emotionally unstable? When they're pressed to make a decision, to perform at a certain level, or are they the very opposite? And so if I can find a way to hone in on what the genesis is to some degree, then I can then address the root problem. So that way I correlatively eliminate the symptoms.
Now, Brian, that brings up a great point. How do you train a manager who's not well versed, partly with types of personalities, with EQ, or who is, let's say, a very task-oriented manager who could really not give a damn what somebody's problems are? And there's a lot of those. It really creates that tough confrontational style that you see sometimes, and nobody really wins very well in that one. Everybody pretty much loses. How do you train managers to be a little more sensitive to the issues of some people with low EQ or just who don't quite get it.
Right. When you look at leadership styles and the paradigmatic makeup of the leadership construct, one of the, or actually two concepts that we look at in my Principles of Management course more intricately is Fred Feidler's contingency model and then Hershey and Blanchard's situational leadership model. And so with, Feidler, his deduction was leadership styles are fixed. So you're either a task-oriented leader or you're a relationship-oriented leader. And the situation, and there's 8, I think, different situational or biological constructs that will dictate what leader is conducive to that particular environment to generate a high level of performance. Hershey and Blanchard, they augment Fred Feidler's concept and they say, okay, leaders can't be static. They can't be stationary. They can be there can be a propagation or a blending of being task oriented or relationship oriented. You just have to find your balance. And so I think for leaders that are having a hard time adapting to maybe such a chaotic environment where you have a lot of emotional disruption, there's a lot of emotional instability, there may be poor leader-member relationships, then I think that leader needs to understand who their followers are, what type of leader they are, and then be able to adapt and be able to be flexible and organic because their leadership styles are going to have to adapt. Their leadership styles are going to have to shift because the followers are going to force them to change their leadership styles.
Yeah.
Well, I like the way that it also is kind of pointing to the fact that it almost seems like there's a revelatory moment where a person feels boxed. They feel boxed in because of lack of self-determination. And that's one of the reasons why, like you were saying, their only option is to lash out or be emotional. So maybe sometimes in those cases, it's sort of counterintuitive that what they really need is a little bit more freedom and more flexibility.
Absolutely. And, I think it's being able to measure and being able to gauge the readiness level of your employees. What's fascinating about Hershey and Blanchard's situational leadership theory is that they're basically saying in layman's terms that your leadership style is contingent upon the situation by which the leader is placed in, as it is impacted by the followers who are subordinate. And so if I have a follower, for example, that is unwilling and unable, then they need a different type of leader as opposed to an individual who is willing and able. Because an individual that's willing and able really doesn't need me as a task-oriented leader, even if that is the majority of the composite relational or the leadership construct. They really don't need me coming in telling them what to do. They already have the ability. They already have the self-efficacy. They're already motivated. There is a closed loop there, so they're going to continue to find ways to self-actualize. As it relates to Maslow's hierarchy of need and the highest point in the pyramid. They're going to continue to find ways to want to do better, to be self-motivated, to have this innate energy, this innate directional sense of what they want to accomplish. Those individuals I don't have to micromanage. However, and as I mentioned earlier, if you have an individual that is unable and unwilling, they need a little bit more structure. So they probably don't need a relationship-oriented or even a delegating manager to just give them responsibility with the expectation that they're going to accomplish that with a level of effectiveness and efficiency. And so again, I think it's purely about understanding who your followers are, because I think once you make that determination and then once you find a resolution, then you can better understand what type of leader you need to be.
And you said something right at the beginning, aside from the dealing with the emotional parts of everything and how people get along, accountability, which goes both ways. It's let's say the employees as well as the management. It's a double-edged sword there, and if it only goes one way, it doesn't work, and it has to go both ways in order to be totally viable. Not always easy to get people to be accountable because they're usually afraid of retribution or whatever else could happen. How do you teach people who, for whatever reason in society, never really became accountable from young ages on, and let them understand that this is your responsibility, your job, what you have to do? And the same goes for the manager, that they have to be accountable, be honest, not lie to people. It's a tough one, because a lot of the people who are I say clawing in a specific way, clawing their way to the top, aren't exactly the nicest people out there, most honest or the best. They're just trying to get up there for whatever reason. Then you have the people working either under them or feeling that they're being thrown under the bus. Nobody's accountable. That's where I see a lot of the problems happening. You've got the emotional issues, but then you have the accountability issues. What do you see as some of the solutions to being accountable?
I think it's understanding that your actions as a leader, they have impact. And individuals, while there are some that don't, you have others that they want to follow. And they want to be able to trust the leader that they are following. They want to have that sense of security, knowing that the leader is conveying information that is ethical, and that the leader themselves are authentic. An individual can actually have all of the traits of a leader. They can have the desire to lead. They can have the desire relevant knowledge. But if you have an individual that has a low proneness to guilt, then it makes it very difficult for followers to work in an environment that is productive, that is conducive to productivity. So if I'm a leader and I have a low proneness to guilt, then that means that my propensity to elude those things that are unethical is very low. Yeah. As opposed to having a high proneness to guilt, which means that I have a high propensity to shun those things that are unethical. So therefore, I'm going to in turn teach my employees and train my employees, condition them, instruct them, mentor them, encourage them, etc., that unethical behavior, just by virtue of my actions, not necessarily verbalizing it, but by virtue of my actions, there are certain behaviors that are just not condoned. Because ultimately, I want to cultivate, and I want organizational citizenship behavior to be germinated in the organization. So if I understand as a leader, I have a great responsibility in knowing that followers are looking to be subject to my leadership. I need to understand that as a leader, I need to exhibit behaviors that are ethical.
Like the old saying, lead by example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think people don't get that. We always joke around that people don't have mirrors. It's like, hello, look at yourself every so often. And it's amazing how many people don't seem to have ever had or want to look at a mirror. It's just an interesting quality of a lot of individuals. Because
think how, go ahead.
No, it's just. It's
see how several years ago, I mean, I guess maybe in the 80s, they said, "Oh, guilt is bad. It should be gotten rid of. Guilt is bad." Now we see if you have no sense of guilt, no propensity to guilt, then basically you become a hero in a book on sociopathy. Sociopathy.
Well, and I think even as it relates to culture, as we alluded to earlier, the leader theoretically, set the tone. So if the leader is exhibiting unethical behavior, if they are exhibiting workforce deviance, then that is going to permeate throughout the organization. And so the organization is basically a composite of deliberately arranged individuals, again, that have been assembled with divergent and somewhat common competencies in order to execute a task to accomplish a goal. And so one of the virtues earlier that we talked about as it relates to culture is that culture is shared. And so if my actions are demonstrative of unethical behavior, and then if that behavior is if there's a reproduction of that behavior, then that's where it's been shared. So if it's continuously shared throughout the organization, then unethical behavior becomes the norm. It doesn't become so abnormal. It actually becomes the norm. And so, again, as it relates to the leader's effect on followers, leaders just have to be mindful that their actions greatly contribute to the culture of an organization.
That's a great point, because it's amazing how quickly it's been proven over and over in history. Why do dictators survive? Things like that. It's because people follow them. After a while, they just go, sure, it's the way we are, and it's a shake your head kind of moment. But what you said is exactly true. In a sicker organization, it's amazing who follows everybody, because they just eventually consider it normal behavior. That's and then, of course, they go to another organization. Now they're pathogens. Now they've moved on, and they're taking that management style or obedience style over to the next organization. And if you get enough of them within a short time, you're going to have the same problems all over again, because they're usually stronger with those kind of sociopathic behaviors than the normal people who are just going, we just want to get along, we just want to do our jobs. And the other comment, no, we got to do this, we got to do that. We can sell better by doing this. I remember once I was looking for a sales position. I don't know why. I was really a techie at heart, but I decided to try sales and I got told by these are very large companies I was applying for. I'll leave them unnamed, but it was interesting. I would apply and they would say, I would never hire you, kid. Why? And by that, I was 30 by then. Why? And they said, you know too much. I know too much. Yeah, you wouldn't BS. You wouldn't sell this, like, let's say it's a printer, which is what it was in some cases, or a copier. You wouldn't sell that correctly because you know what doesn't work. Well, wouldn't you want to tell somebody maybe what doesn't work so therefore they don't have to? No, that's not sales. Yes, it is. It's called solution selling. No, kid, you don't get it. And that was really an approach. And I went, no, maybe I don't want to go into sales. I mean, not that kind of sales, because it's funny what's considered the norm in some. And I had the experience one time. I was a director of IT at a medium-sized company. And I get a call from the front desk saying, your appointment for 2:00 is here. I go, I don't have an appointment at 2:00. No, they said they're here and they're from a very large computer company. Okay, I'll be right out. I had no appointment, never talked to this person. So I get to the front and the guy goes, Rick? Yeah, nice to meet you. Let's go to the conference room. We had a conference room right by the front entrance. And I sat them down. It was the sales guy and a newbie sales person, a saleswoman who had just joined the company. He was training her. And I said, so what meeting did we have? Oh, well, we had set a meeting at 2 p.m. I go, really? I don't remember ever talking with you. I have a pretty good memory. So, and when did you call me? Well, it was like several weeks ago. Okay. And you talked to me? Oh, yeah, we talked. Really? Okay. And so I grilled him a little bit, and I said, okay, let's just be honest about this. So I pointed at the girl, you, don't learn from him. He's sending you in the wrong path. You, don't lie about sales. Don't lie that we have a meeting when we have never talked. We've never done anything in our lives. And you're trying to teach her this method to get into a company. One, why would I trust your company if you're representing them by lying? Two, why would I trust you as a new sales rep when you're learning how to lie from this guy? So please go back, learn how to do it right. Don't do this again. And I let them out, and they left. And I don't know what ever happened to him or her. And this is a very large computer. I've worked with other people in that company. And I just shook my head going, why would you start any relationship with the pretense of a lie? Is that a management? That was a sales manager. It's like, ay. So this is what you see everywhere, and I've seen it since with people. I've been offered bribes by large computer companies, and you go, no, we don't do this. And I call it short-term gain for very, very long-term loss. And people don't seem to get that. And that's, again, accountability, ethics. That's one of the least liked courses in almost every university, ethics. But boy, is it necessary. What do you think of situations like that, Brian?
Well, I think you had alluded to something earlier where your decision, when you overlook all variables, and you only see what outcome can be generated, those are constant decisions that are being made within organizations. And so whenever you look at bias errors, then you have an instant gratification bias where I overlook unethical behavior, I overlook the potential impression of the unethical behavior and what that may induce, because I see the possibility of building this relationship that can generate some type of monetary value. Right. So I'm willing to overlook that. And so whenever you have this erroneous mechanism with instant gratification bias, it then becomes a norm to the point where me bribing you really doesn't bother me, because it now has become habitual. Again, that's the normality. This is how quote unquote, this is just how we do business. Yeah. And so because the converse, as you alluded to earlier, you can't work here because you know too much to not be unethical.
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And it really comes down to upbringing. It comes down to social conditioning, to how people get along in their peer groups and everything else. Somewhere there's something that clicks off, and people forget the thank yous, the I'm sorries, the ability to tell the truth to someone, not only in their
civility.
We were talking earlier in the office today about behaviors, and we were talking about congruent behaviors. Somebody who's congruent is the same there, here, wherever they are. They're always the same. And people who aren't congruent aren't that trustworthy, because you never know where they're coming from. They'll be very nice at work, and then they beat their wives at home, or they're beating their employees at work and treating their wife or their husband nice at home. And you just go, that's an incongruent behavior. Or they go to church and they're the nicest people on earth, and then on the side they've got 4 mistresses, and you just go, oh, wow, what happened with the and it happens, and you see it all the time, and you just go, where are we getting these disconnects? And Professor, I'm sure that's something you probably cover, of some of the disconnects of our lives and how those patterns reflect everybody else.
Absolutely. I know we use real life celebrities in what shift they are enthralled in. And I ask my students, can you separate Bill Cosby, for example, the man, from Dr. Heathcliff Huxtable on The Cosby Show? Can you separate Chris Brown, who is and as some would consider, later on in his career, a musical savant, very talented, almost, equitable to Michael Jackson. Can you separate the artist from the abuser? And so shifting that inquiry, can you follow an individual who has all of the traits of a good leader? Their outcomes are favorable. They have evidence-based management decision-making prowess. They have, intuitive decision-making prowess that augments that. But they're a habitual liar. Can you follow someone like that that actually has the acumen, but doesn't possess the moral compass?
Exactly.
Yep. Now, it's interesting.
Ethical behavior.
It's interesting.
Can you properly follow someone that actually has that imbalance?
That's a really good point.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I would say absolutely not. Even though you don't see that, because you become blind to it. There's so many ways that we deceive ourselves. I like the way you talked about the different ways that we cognitive blindness.
And this is interesting. You mentioned Cosby, and I had a personal experience with Cosby when I was 18 years old. And it's funny. I went to a school in LA. It was called LA High, Los Angeles High School. It was about 80% black. And one of my jobs, I was in the journalism department, and one of my jobs was to try to get guests for assemblies that we had. So we didn't hold back. Being in the LA area, we got lots of stars, and we can get. So I invited Bill Cosby to be at our senior assembly for the graduating class. He accepted, free of charge. This is 1972. He came. He did a little bit of comedy, and then he spoke for over an hour about life, getting jobs, getting an education, working hard to be good at anything you do. And people are going, well, he wasn't that funny. No, he wasn't. He was helping people with their life. And it was quite a remarkable moment. And then, I've watched him throughout his whole career. He's been very funny. He's done some really good things. And then that harassment thing came out. I don't know what the final result is. I never really heard. It was hard to prove and whatever else. But it was one of those besmirching campaigns. And you don't know, was he really that bad? Was he good? And how do you separate that from the other parts where you saw him do good or you watched the comedy you were enjoyed? It's a tough one. Was he really that way, or was he the other way, or was he both? And he just lived being two different people. Don't know.
Well, and I think what's also interesting is that individuals see leaders or celebrities, as we were just mentioning. We see people in episodes.
Yes.
We don't see individuals when the proverbial show has went off the air. We only see individuals in seasons. We don't see them in the shooting phase of the series itself.
Right.
Figuratively. And so Laura Loughlin, for example, one of the wealthy parents that is caught up with Felicity Huffman in the college cheating scandal. Everybody knew her as Aunt Becky on Full House. I grew up watching Full House when I was in junior high and high school, so I only knew her as Aunt Becky, but she played a role on TV. And I think, you had talked about congruency earlier, and that level of synchronization as far as an individual being one way here, but then also being the same way in another environmental context, and then also being the same way in another situation, and being the same way in a totally different situation. And so, what we saw from Aunt Becky is that, guess what? She was the same on Full House every time we watched the show.
Right.
She was not divergent of her character's role and her virtues and her qualities, how she interacted. Her personality was totally different from Laura Loughlin. And I think we as managers need, and as leaders more so, need to not treat leadership as a role, but find a level of congruency between who we are as people outside of that leadership role, and then be that same person within that leadership role.
I really like that. That's like leadership is life.
Yep.
Absolutely.
The audience likes it too.
That's
really is a good point.
Dr. Matthews.
Yep, but that's a very good point, because you can't act the role forever, and actors prove that. In the old days, the only reason actors seemed better was because they were controlled, and how, by the studios.
Oh yeah.
And also, Hollywood had a code of ethics until about the 1960s. And that code of ethics, they forced on those actors, like it or not. So the actors got in trouble, but nobody knew it. Not anymore. So things have changed. And, actors are really interesting. There's some very smart actors. There's some very not too bright actors, a lot of emotional ones, a lot of addicted ones in it. It's a mess, but you're right. When they're on screen, they look great. And that doesn't mean they are. So it's interesting. Well, we are out of time. We've actually gone way beyond. We're sorry we kept you so long, but this is a great conversation. We'd love to have you back on.
Yeah, this is great.
I definitely look forward to it. And anytime you want to invite me back, I will definitely make myself available.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate that.
Good.
And because, we just don't have these conversations that often. They're great conversations, and they make a difference.
Definitely.
Well, great.
Wow, so great. And thank you, Dr. Matthews. This was, I just think that we touched so many topics and so many theories that have direct bearing on the things that are happening right now. It's really, you've given us a lot of
food for thought. Material and food for thought. Yep.
No, it was definitely a pleasure. So, Rick and Dr. Nash, I greatly appreciate the invitation, and definitely look forward to doing this again.
Thank you much, and we appreciate you and the work you do. So,
Thank
you much. If you like the show, let us know. We'll have information for how to reach Dr. Matthews below, and we'll also have links to his website. I think we have links. We'll have links so that you can get a hold of Dr. Matthews if you want to learn more. Thank you again, and we will see you guys next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
And we are done.